There is a particular species of man who survives not through intelligence, competence, or even charm, but through the sheer biological stubbornness of a cockroach that refuses to vacate a condemned building. In the rich, morally bankrupt ecosystem of The Sopranos, that man is Peter Paul Gualtieri, known to friends, enemies, and the increasingly exasperated audience as Paulie Walnuts. He is, without exaggeration, the most persistently irritating, spectacularly incompetent, and paradoxically enduring figure in the entire DeMeo crime family. He is also, it must be said, one of the funniest characters in the history of prestige television. A man so profoundly lacking in self-awareness that he could flatline a comatose mob boss simply by talking about the elevation of his own testicles. That is not a metaphor. That actually happens. The scene in question, widely and correctly regarded as one of the most darkly hilarious moments the show ever produced, finds Tony Soprano lying in a hospital bed, suspended somewhere between life and death after being shot by his own uncle. The family has been instructed, in terms that could not possibly be clearer, to keep the atmosphere around Tony calm and stress-free. Enter Paulie Walnuts, a man for whom the concept of reading the room might as well be written in Sanskrit. He settles into the chair beside his unconscious boss and proceeds to deliver an extended monologue about, among other pressing matters, the condition of his genitals, the doctor's recommendation that he wear a jockstrap, and the general state of his digestive distress. The heart monitor begins to accelerate. The beeping grows frantic. Tony Soprano, deep in a coma, in a liminal space between this world and whatever Kevin Finnerty's hotel represents, becomes so agitated by Paulie's relentless yapping that his heart simply stops. The medical team rushes in. Paulie glances around with the guilty, bewildered expression of a dog who has just knocked a lamp off a table, and quietly slips out of the room. The genius of this scene operates on multiple frequencies. On the surface, it is slapstick of the highest order. A man so annoying he can literally kill someone who is already unconscious. But underneath that comedy sits something far more telling about who Paulie Walnuts fundamentally is. Meadow, moments earlier, had gently asked him to keep things positive around her father. Paulie sat down, nodded with apparent understanding, and immediately launched into a detailed medical report about his scrotal support requirements. A few scenes later, he was back at Tony's bedside, complaining about his agita. The man was not ignoring instructions. He was simply constitutionally incapable of following them. His mouth operated on a frequency entirely disconnected from his brain, which itself appeared to be running on auxiliary power at the best of times. And then there is the sublime editorial choice of cutting from Paulie's bedside rambling to Kevin Finnerty, Tony's coma world alter ego, banging on the wall of his hotel room, demanding that his neighbors shut up. Listen closely during that transition, and the noise bleeding through the wall is, unmistakably, the sound of Paulie talking. Even in the purgatorial space between life and death, Tony Soprano cannot escape this man's voice. If that is not the most devastating commentary on a lifelong professional relationship, nothing is. But here's where the analysis must pivot from comedy to something considerably darker, because Paulie Walnuts is not merely a source of comic relief. He is, upon any honest examination, one of the most genuinely vile human beings the show ever produced. The distinction is that his vileness operates at a different register than the more obvious monsters of the series. Ralph Cifaretto was sadistic and theatrical about it. Phil Leotardo was cruel with the cold, grinding efficiency of institutional resentment. Paulie's particular brand of awfulness is subtler, wrapped in the packaging of a lovable neighborhood character, a guy who says, heh, and snaps his fingers at waitresses, and has that magnificent silver-winged hair that suggests a man who spends more time in front of a mirror than any 3 women combined. Strip away the comedy, though, and the resume is staggering. This is a man who smothered an elderly woman, Min Matrone, a friend of the woman who raised him, and robbed her of her savings. He sniffed Adriana Lacerva's undergarments, an act so gratuitously repulsive that it barely registers amid the broader catalog of his transgressions. He systematically tormented Christopher Moltisanti about his sobriety, needling and provoking him with the relentless precision of a man who understood exactly which buttons to press and pressed them anyway. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of a bottomless need for dominance that masqueraded as banter. That torment, it bears noting, contributed directly to the chain of events that led Christopher back into addiction, which led to the murder of his screenwriter friend, which led to the car crash, which led to Tony suffocating Christopher with his bare hands. Paulie did not pull any of those triggers, but he loaded several of the guns. He abandoned the woman who raised him, Nucci, the only person on Earth who appeared to genuinely love him without condition or agenda, after discovering she was not his biological mother. The woman had devoted her life to him. His response was to cut her off financially and emotionally, punishing her for a deception committed out of love decades earlier. It was, by any reasonable moral standard, unforgivable. In a show populated by murderers, extortionists, and drug dealers, Paulie's treatment of his mother somehow managed to feel like one of the most reprehensible acts of the entire series, precisely because it required no external pressure. Nobody made him do it. Nobody benefited from it. It was pure, petty cruelty, directed at the one person who had earned his loyalty, and it revealed the hollow core beneath all the bluster and bravado. He was, furthermore, an absolutely catastrophic gossip. The Ginny Sack joke, Ralph Cifaretto's tasteless crack about Johnny Sack's wife, became a geopolitical crisis between the New York and New Jersey families because Paulie could not resist repeating it. The fallout from that single act of indiscretion rippled through multiple seasons, poisoning alliances, igniting feuds, and nearly getting people killed. In the world of organized crime, where information is currency and discretion is survival, Paulie operated with the verbal restraint of a man live streaming his own colonoscopy. He talked to Johnny Sack about internal Jersey business. He discussed the possibility of Tony being hit with a casualness that suggested he was weighing dinner options, rather than the assassination of the man who signed his paychecks. The fact that he was never formally punished for any of this speaks less to any political skill on his part, and more to the general dysfunction of the organization he served. Which brings us to Pine Barrens, the episode that functions as a kind of inflection point in the Tony-Paulie relationship, and, not coincidentally, one of the finest hours of television ever produced. The assignment was simple: collect $5,000 from a Russian named Valery. That was it, a task so straightforward that a moderately trained retriever could have accomplished it with minimal supervision. Paulie, predictably, turned it into an international incident. What should have been a 15-minute errand became a botched murder, a desperate manhunt through the frozen New Jersey Pine Barrens, frostbite, near starvation, catastrophically bad cell phone reception, and the permanent jeopardizing of Tony's relationship with Slava, a valuable Russian contact. The beauty of the episode, beyond its darkly comic brilliance, is that it crystallizes everything wrong with Paulie as a professional criminal. He could not manage a simple collection without escalating it into a survival situation. He could not confirm whether the target was actually dead. He could not navigate the woods, could not keep his composure, could not stop complaining about the cold and the hunger and the general unfairness of his circumstances. Silvio would not have botched it, because the collection was his responsibility in the first place, and he was too ill to handle it. Furio would have collected the money, wiped the mayonnaise off Valeri's face if necessary, and gone home. Even Benny Fazio, a man whose primary qualification for organized crime appeared to be his willingness to show up, would have managed the basic mechanics of the transaction. Christopher, to his credit, at least understood the diplomatic significance of the Slava relationship. Paulie, a man who had been in the life for decades longer, could not even process why antagonizing a connected Russian might have consequences. The gap between his tenure and his competence was oceanic. Tony told him afterward that the decision to abandon the search and go home was Paulie's to own, and that any consequences would fall on his shoulders. It was the closest Tony came at that point to saying what the audience had been thinking for seasons: this man is not serious. And yet, the show refused to dispose of him. David Chase, in what can only be interpreted as either profound thematic commitment or exquisite malice, kept Paulie alive through every massacre, every purge, every thinning of the ranks. Bobby Baccalieri, a fundamentally decent man in an indecent profession, was gunned down in a model train store. Christopher Moltisanti, for all his failings, at least possessed ambition and something resembling creative intelligence. He died with Tony's hand over his nose. Silvio Dante, the consigliere, the voice of reason, the man who actually kept the books balanced and the operations running, ended the series in a coma from which he would almost certainly never wake. And Paulie sat outside Satrial's in the sunshine, catching rays, very much alive. The last man standing in a crew that had been systematically annihilated. The thematic implications of this are almost too perfect to bear. Chase, who famously refused to tie up loose ends or deliver the narrative satisfactions that audiences demanded, understood something essential about the nature of organizations and the men who populate them. The competent ones burn out. The ambitious ones self-destruct. The decent ones get consumed by the machinery. But the cockroach, the guy with no family, no real responsibilities, no grand vision, no particular skills beyond an animal instinct for self-preservation, the cockroach endures. Paulie Walnuts is the career middle manager of organized crime, a man perpetually adjusting his sails to whichever way the wind happens to be blowing, going about in pity of himself while the empire crumbles around him. He survived not because he was strong or clever, but because he was, in the most fundamental sense, disposable. Nobody bothered to kill him, because nobody considered him important enough to kill. There is a scene late in the series, after Paulie is released from prison, that captures his essential nature with devastating economy. The crew has gathered at the Bada Bing to welcome him home. The camera pushes in on Paulie's face as a smile slowly spreads across it. The audience expects he is looking at a person, a friend, a loved one, someone who missed him. Instead, he says, softly, almost tenderly, my song. He is smiling at the jukebox. The man went to prison, and the thing he missed most was a song on a machine. He had no one waiting for him. No wife, no children, no genuine friends. He never even removed the plastic covering from his couch. He was, in the most literal sense, a man who lived his entire life without forming a single, authentic human connection. And the tragedy is that he appeared to be entirely fine with this arrangement, or at least too emotionally undeveloped to recognize what he was missing. This emotional emptiness is precisely what made him so dangerous to those around him. People without attachments have nothing to lose, and people with nothing to lose make unpredictable allies. The question of whether Paulie was involved in the conspiracy against Tony, assuming one accepts the widely held interpretation that Tony was killed in the final scene at Holston's, is one of the most debated topics in the show's considerable history of debated topics. The evidence, such as it is, operates entirely in the realm of visual suggestion and circumstantial inference. There are the barber scissors he distributed as gifts in the final episode, echoing the barbershop where the New York faction met to discuss eliminating Tony's top people. There is the fact that Butchie, during that meeting, specifically exempted Paulie from the kill list, a curious detail if Paulie were merely an irrelevant old soldier rather than a potential asset. There is his conspicuous departure from the Bada Bing during the preparations for the Phil Leotardo hit, speeding away with no explanation offered and none demanded by the narrative. There is the lingering camera on his face in his final scenes, an expression that reads less like contentment and more like the particular sadness of a man who has made a decision he cannot undo. Against this, there is the equally compelling argument that Paulie was simply not capable of orchestrating such a thing. He had no political connections to speak of, no business acumen, no demonstrated capacity for strategic thinking beyond the most rudimentary level. New York had already shown him, during his ill-advised flirtation with Johnny Sack's crew, that they regarded him as a useful idiot at best, someone to extract information from, not someone to build alliances with. The notion that he could have brokered a deal to have Tony eliminated and somehow install himself in a position of authority afterward requires a level of sophistication that nothing in 6 seasons of evidence suggests he possessed. The more persuasive reading is that Paulie was simply informed, perhaps by Butchie, perhaps by another intermediary, that Tony was not going to survive the aftermath of Phil Leotardo's very public, very messy assassination. Phil was shot in front of his wife and grandchildren, and his head was subsequently crushed by his own vehicle, an image so grotesque that even hardened criminals would have found it difficult to let slide. New York had 100 soldiers and a legitimate grievance. The calculus was not complicated. Tony was a dead man, and Paulie, ever the survivalist, was given the option to step aside rather than go down with the ship. He did not need to plan anything. He did not need to make phone calls or hire assassins. He simply needed to do what he had always done best, nothing, and let the inevitable unfold. This interpretation aligns with the broader thematic architecture of the finale, which resists the identification of a single conspirator in favor of something far more unsettling, the ambient, omnidirectional threat that defines life in organized crime. The danger could come from New York, from a disgruntled associate, from the family of a past victim, from the FBI, from anywhere. The unnamed man in the members-only jacket who enters the diner in the final scene is deliberately anonymous, deliberately unconnected to any established plotline, because the point is not who kills Tony, but that Tony was always going to be killed. The life does not permit retirement. It does not offer pension plans or golden parachutes. It offers a booth at a restaurant and a man you have never seen before walking toward the bathroom behind you. Paulie, meanwhile, sits in the sun outside Satrial's and survives. He survives because surviving is the only thing he was ever truly good at. What makes this survival so thematically rich is that it is also, unmistakably, a kind of damnation. Paulie has no family. His mother, the woman who raised him, died estranged from him because of his own cruelty. His biological mother he refused to acknowledge. Christopher, the closest thing he had to a protege, or at least a consistent sparring partner, is dead. Bobby is dead. Silvio is functionally dead. Tony, if the prevailing interpretation holds, is about to be dead. The crew that constituted Paulie's entire social universe has been obliterated, and he is left sitting in a lawn chair outside a pork store, with nothing but sunshine and silence, and a stray cat that may or may not be the reincarnated spirit of a woman whose underwear he once sniffed. The cat detail, incidentally, is one of Chase's more delicious touches. The animal takes an inexplicable interest in a photograph of Christopher Moltisanti, staring at it with an intensity that unnerves Paulie to his core. Whether or not one subscribes to the theory that the cat represents Adriana, the woman Christopher loved and betrayed, the woman the crew murdered and buried in the woods, the fact that Paulie is so disturbed by it reveals something essential about his psychology. For all his bluster about being a tough guy, for all the murders and robberies and acts of casual brutality, Paulie Walnuts was fundamentally a superstitious, frightened man. His germophobia, his obsession with psychics, his terror of the supernatural, these were not quirks. They were the coping mechanisms of a man who had committed acts he could not fully rationalize, and who lived in perpetual, low-grade dread of cosmic retribution. Consider the arc of his interactions with Tony across the full span of the series, and what emerges is something remarkably like a failed marriage. In the early seasons, there is genuine warmth, a sense of mutual reliance that, if not quite affection, at least approximated professional respect. Paulie admired Tony. Tony valued Paulie's loyalty, if not his intellect. They functioned, within the parameters of their violent enterprise, as something close to family. The erosion began in Italy, during the trip that was supposed to reconnect Tony with his ancestral roots. Instead, it connected him with the full, unvarnished reality of who Paulie Walnuts was, outside the familiar context of New Jersey. Paulie talked incessantly. He asked inane questions during business dinners. He embarrassed Tony in front of Italian associates, who regarded this loud, graceless American with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt. Tony looked at Paulie through a hotel window, watching him cackle at some mindless television program, and saw three things simultaneously: an idiot who was incapable of seriousness, a man whose happiness was an affront to Tony's own misery, and a liability, whose mouth would eventually cost the organization something it could not afford to lose. The Florida trip completed the dissolution. Tony, by this point in the series, had largely abandoned the capacity for trust. His relationship with Hesh had been poisoned by gambling debts and the corrosive mathematics of money owed between friends. His relationship with Christopher had curdled into mutual contempt, with the Cleaver film serving as a barely coded act of creative patricide. And Paulie, who had been at Tony's father's side when Johnny Boy pushed a young Tony into the life by making him kill Willie Overall. Paulie represented the last living link to a past that Tony was increasingly recognizing as poisoned at the root. Johnny Boy was not the romantic figure Tony had constructed in his memory. Livia was not the sole architect of his misery. And Paulie, the loyal old soldier, the man Tony once said he wished had been his father, was not loyal at all. He was merely present, which is a very different thing. That boat ride off the coast of Florida, with Tony smiling at Paulie like a shark, and Paulie shifting nervously in his seat, was as close to a marital confrontation as two men in that world were capable of having. Tony wanted confirmation that Paulie had leaked the ginny sack joke. Paulie wanted to survive the afternoon. Both men understood the stakes. Neither said what he actually meant. It was, in its way, a perfect encapsulation of every conversation they had ever had, full of subtext, empty of honesty, and conducted under the permanent threat of lethal violence. The deeper irony is that Paulie, for all his failings, was in many ways the most honest expression of what the mob life actually produces. Not the romanticized version, not the Corleone family with its codes of honor and operatic grandeur, but the real thing, petty, venal, stupid, cruel, and astonishingly resilient. Paulie was not a boss. He was not a strategist. He was not even a particularly effective earner. He was a bully who terrorized waiters and construction workers and anyone else who lacked the power to fight back. He was a gossip who traded secrets like baseball cards, oblivious to the consequences until they arrived at his doorstep. He was a killer who murdered old women for their mattress money and then went home to sleep on a plastic-covered couch. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man who thrives in exactly this kind of organization. Too insignificant to be a target, too stubborn to be dislodged, and too oblivious to understand that his survival was not a testament to his strength, but to his irrelevance. And yet, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth the show forces its audience to confront, he is irresistibly, infuriatingly likable. Tony Sirico's performance is so perfectly calibrated, so rich in physical comedy and vocal peculiarity, that the viewer cannot help but be charmed by a man who, on paper, is an absolute monster. That disconnection between the character's likability and his moral reality is not a flaw in the writing. It is the entire point. Every great mob story asks its audience to reckon with the seductive power of charisma, and The Sopranos understood better than any of its peers that the most dangerous seduction is not the one offered by the calculating boss or the psychopathic enforcer, but by the neighborhood guy, the funny one, the one who says things like, and complains about his agita, and makes everyone laugh, even as he is, quietly and consistently, making everything worse for everyone around him. On some level, everyone has known a Paulie. Not the murderous criminal version, obviously, but the social animal who is so profoundly unaware of his own effect on others that he ends up alone far more often than he realizes. The person who can be walking through any environment, a shopping mall, a museum, a funeral, and still be carrying on about the most spectacularly pointless nonsense imaginable. The person whose company is exhausting, not because of malice, but because of an absolute vacuum where self-awareness should be. Paulie Walnuts is that person, elevated to the level of art and then handed a gun. He should have been eliminated seasons before the finale. He should have been removed from the organization after the Pine Barrens debacle, or after the ginny sack leak, or after any one of a dozen incidents that would have been career-ending for a less tenacious parasite. Tony considered it on that boat in Florida and pulled back. Not because Paulie convinced him of anything, but because killing Paulie would have been like swatting at a fly that had been buzzing around the room for so long it had become part of the ambient noise. The effort would have exceeded the reward. And so Paulie endured. He endured because the universe of The Sopranos is not a meritocracy. It does not reward the capable or punish the incompetent with any particular consistency. It is, like the real world it so ruthlessly mirrors, a system in which survival often has less to do with fitness than with the simple, inglorious talent for being too small to notice and too stubborn to die. Paulie Walnuts was never boss material. He was never even captain material, really, despite the title being thrust upon him in the final hours like a participation trophy handed to the last kid standing after everyone else has been sent home. He was a soldier. He was a cockroach. He was the funniest, most infuriating, most morally reprehensible background character in the history of American television. And he outlived them all. That, more than any other detail in the show's magnificent, maddening final season, might be the darkest joke David Chase ever told. Subscribe.